The Xinjiang province of northwestern China is home to millions of Uyghur Muslims. It is also home to one of the most expansive human rights atrocities of the modern world. The Chinese Communist Party, since the time of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, has been actively working towards the cultural eradication of this community, wiping out its history, traditions and autonomy, and effectively erasing its identity as an ethnic minority. It has been involved in large-scale persecutions of Uyghur academics and scholars, in the arbitrary detention of Uyghur civilians, and in the destruction of any links to the Uyghur culture among the children in that community. This video seeks to discuss the cultural genocide of the Uyghur population in China, the position of international and domestic law, the global politics concerning the issue, and the path forward. When Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide in his book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe in 1944, he meant for it to include not just the physical destruction of the members of the minority community, but the destruction of its political and social institutions, its culture, its language, and its religion. But when the United Nations adopted it into written international law in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment for the Crime of Genocide, it involved only crimes pertaining to the physical destruction of its members and the forced indoctrination of its younger members away from the traditions of the minority group. The concept of the destruction of the culture and the way of life of an ethnic minority was ignored. During the Cultural Revolution in China, which lasted from 1966 to 1976, under the eyes of Mao Zedong, the Uyghur population faced violent and large-scale persecution. His successor Deng Xiaoping orchestrated mass migrations of the majority Han Chinese population into the Xinjiang region with an aim to dilute its Uyghur population. Hu Jintao's strike-hard policy of severe crackdowns on terrorism came in the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks, and the atmosphere of xenophobia that followed allowed him to conveniently persecute Uyghur populations under terror suspicions. Xi Jinping, the current president of the People's Republic of China, has gone a step further to create laws for the persecution of this minority community in the name of national security. In 2015, Xi Jinping's Congress passed a new national security law which allowed for wide powers to the government in the suppression of the Uyghur minority owing to its vague language and broad scope. The High Commissioner for Human Rights at the time explained that the broad terminology of the law could serve to fuel large-scale abuse of the rights of the minority populations in China, with the government and the party having little to no accountability. Another counterterrorism law was passed by the Chinese Congress, where a broad definition of terrorism and extremism and a lack of a judicial appeals process for the accused and the lack of enough means to provide a fair trial has collectively led to the establishment of an unquestionable power of Chinese law enforcement to violate the human rights of the Uyghur and Tibetan minorities with little oversight. The OHCHR noted in 2019 that the freedom of speech, movement and assembly of minorities was in danger, noting that Uyghur Muslims have since been detained for simply practicing their faith, and the freedom of religion and conscience was endangered among China's minority populations. Finally, in Xinjiang, the government passed its own law for the prevention of extremist ideas. Its broad scope has since been used to persecute Uyghur Muslims simply practicing the Islamic faith, and has served as the basis for the creation of re-education camps by the government. This began the process of the cultural genocide that is being waged against the Uyghur population, aimed at the destruction of its religious and ethnic identity. The Xinjiang province is of great strategic importance to the Chinese, with its key geographical placement in the Belt and Road Initiative and the Western Development Program, with China aiming to develop the region into the Eurasian Land Bridge or the New Silk Road. The Chinese, in their attempts at the suppression of the expression and practice of their faith, imposed several repressive policies on the Uyghur populations, and resistance from the Uyghurs was classified as externally sponsored terrorism, with no acknowledgement of the role of China's own oppression in the retaliatory protests. The Chinese took advantage of an atmosphere of xenophobia and Islamophobia at the time to build several frameworks for the strategic destruction of the Uyghur culture. This began with the creation of what the party calls vocational educational centers, which are in fact heavily guarded internment camps where Uyghur civilians have been detained indefinitely until the Uyghur identity of their character is wiped off. Uyghur scholars and academics have been special targets with their sudden disappearances from their societies. Giving up smoking or drinking, studying Arabic, maintaining beards and praying outside mosques have been seen as signs of extremism and have been reason enough for the detention of civilians. Coercive ideological remolding accompanied by long periods of internment, brainwashing and brutal torture has been reported by the Journal of Political Risk in 2019, with over 1 million detainees in the camp in the beginning of 2020. But it's not just Uyghur adults. Soon after, details emerged of the placing of Uyghur children in the care of the state, when both the parents had been detained. These children are subject to curriculums of political indoctrination and psychological coercion with highly Han Chinese intensive linguistic and cultural training. These children have no link to the Uyghur culture that they would otherwise have inherited and learned from their families. Instead, the party creates an intergenerational gap among the Uyghur parents and their children and eradicates the ethnic identity that they were born into to replace it with something more suitable to the party's Han Chinese preferences. When the world first became aware of these detention centers, the party organized heavily guided tours for international diplomats, but a subsequent letter by a collective of human rights NGOs with the United Nations Human Rights Council calling for meaningful access for independent researchers was ignored. The domestic judicial system in China is in no position to oppose the party, and it seems like there is no desire to do so either. International human rights law is the only remaining recourse to this community under attack. As we discussed earlier, the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide does not cover cultural genocide in its definition of the crime. The International Criminal Court, via its founding Rome Statute, is bound by this definition. Article 21 of the Rome Statute, however, allows for the court to consider principles of natural justice, and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has, as in the case of the Srebrenica massacre, clarified that the practice of ethnic cleansing amounts to genocide. In another case, the prosecutor versus Al-Mahdi, the court clarified that the destruction of cultural property during conflict amounts to a war crime. These judgments have set important precedent where destruction of the identity of the victim is recognized as opposed to solely the recognition of his physical safety. But China is not a state party to the International Criminal Court, and its leaders cannot be produced before the court except by the recommendation of the United Nations Security Council. China, however, sits as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and thus has a veto vote in all of its decisions. So it is entirely impossible that a resolution can be passed to produce the Chinese before the court. China doesn't hold itself accountable to the International Court of Justice either. And the best that the court can do is conduct a deep and informative research into the matter and release an advisory opinion for the information and awareness of the world community. In July 2019, a collective of 22 nations took a stand in the UN against the large-scale violations of the human rights of Uyghurs in China. These were largely Western nations, and the next day came a wave of support for China from 37 nations which sought to deny the accusations and instead praised China for its human rights record. Over 1 million Uyghur Muslims are illegally detained in China and are suffering for their faith and their ethnicity. And yet the 37 nations who rose up in support of China include the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the Syrian Arab Republic, the United Arab Emirates, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It might be pertinent to note that China owns colossal sums of money in investments and debt in some of these countries. But when political and financial pressures, even greed, keeps the leaders silent, the people must agitate. And that's where we come in. Human rights begin with you and I. So read, talk, and spread awareness. You can find some links in the description below where you can find some credible sources and perhaps donate to the human rights groups involved in fighting for the Uyghurs. Cultural genocide has been dead for 7 decades, and the Communist Party seems intent on reviving it. Those with a lot to lose are scared, but those of us who have the privilege of speaking up must do so.